In this video, we dive into a series of recent incidents that reveal a deeply alarming reality. Police officers are increasingly being targeted in moments that should be routine and controlled. These are not distant historical crimes. They are happening now inside interrogation rooms, police stations, and even retail stores. One pulled trigger, one missed search, 1 second of hesitation can mean the difference between life and death. What makes these cases so disturbing is not just the violence, but how close the system itself comes to catastrophic failure. Shane Newman, State, Ohio, age 21, waiting for sentence. In December 2025, what began as a routine shoplifting call inside a Walmart in Canton, Ohio nearly became a homicide that would have sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. Shane Newman, just 21 years old and already carrying a history of drug-related offenses and probation violations, was brought into the store's loss prevention room after being caught stealing with his girlfriend, Katerina Jeffrey. It was supposed to be paperwork, handcuffs, and a short ride to jail. Instead, it turned into a moment where a single mechanical failure decided whether a police officer would go home alive. Inside that cramped back room, surveillance blind and designed for retail discipline rather than violence, tensions escalated quickly. Newman began to struggle with the responding officer. Then, in a split second that feels almost unreal when replayed in court descriptions, Newman reached into his pocket and produced a firearm. He raised it. He aimed directly at the officer's face, and he pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. Nothing else happened. The weapon jammed. No explosion. No muzzle flash. Just silence. In that instant, the officer's life was spared not by training, not by backup, but by a malfunctioning gun. The gravity of what almost happened is hard to overstate. Had that weapon fired, this would not be an attempted murder case still winding its way through court. It would have been the killing of a police officer inside a Walmart during a shoplifting arrest in the middle of the holiday season. A civilian employee, realizing what was unfolding, rushed into the room and helped restrain Newman. A violent struggle followed before officers finally subdued him and placed him in custody. The scene left behind was not marked by blood, but by the chilling awareness of how close it came. Investigators quickly uncovered that Newman was prohibited from possessing a firearm. He was already on probation from prior cases dating back to 2023. A search connected to his arrest revealed roughly 50 pills suspected to be MDMA, adding another layer to the charges stacking against him. Prosecutors moved fast. Newman was booked into the Stark County Jail and soon appeared in Canton Municipal Court around December 23 to 24, 2025. The list of charges read like a worst-case scenario: narrowly avoided attempted murder, felonious assault on a police officer, robbery, aggravated drug possession, and having a weapon under disability. The court set bond at $1 million, signaling how seriously the system viewed the threat posed in that Walmart back room. As of December 30, 2025, the case remains active, with prosecutors preparing to take the evidence before a grand jury. There is no final verdict yet, no sentence to measure against the danger of that moment. But the questions linger. Should survival by luck carry the same moral weight as death by violence? And if the gun had not jammed, would anyone be debating how severe justice should be, or would the outcome already be written in stone? Micah Xavier Johnson, State, Texas, age 25, killed in the act. On the evening of July 7, 2016, downtown Dallas was supposed to be a place of protest and civic expression, not a battlefield. As police officers lined the streets to protect a peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstration, few of them realized they were being watched, tracked, and deliberately selected as targets. Micah Xavier Johnson, a a 25-year-old Army Reserve veteran who had served in Afghanistan, had already decided that this night would end in blood. What followed would become the deadliest attack on U.S. law enforcement since 9/11, a coordinated ambush that left 5 officers dead and 9 others wounded in a matter of minutes. Johnson did not act in a frenzy or panic. Investigators later described him as methodical, patient, and disturbingly focused. Armed with a rifle and a handgun, he positioned himself strategically and opened fire on officers who were standing guard, many of them unaware they were under direct attack, until bullets began tearing through the crowd. Witnesses described chaos as officers scrambled for cover while civilians ran for their lives. Johnson specifically targeted white police officers, later telling negotiators that he was angry over police shootings of black men, particularly the recent deaths of Alton Sterling in Louisiana and Philando Castile in Minnesota. His violence, in his own words, was meant as retaliation. As the shooting unfolded, Johnson moved through the area with military-style precision, eventually retreating into the El Centro College complex. There, the situation escalated into a prolonged standoff that lasted for hours. Police attempted to negotiate, believing they might be able to take him into custody. During those tense exchanges, Johnson revealed himself as a self-described lone wolf, claiming no affiliation with any organized group. Searches of his home later uncovered a personal arsenal and materials consistent with homemade explosives, reinforcing concerns that his attack was not spontaneous, but carefully planned. What happened next marked a turning point in American policing. With negotiations failing and the threat of further casualties looming, Dallas police commanders made a decision never before used in U.S. law enforcement history. A bomb disposal robot was fitted with an explosive device and remotely guided toward Johnson's position. When the charge detonated, Micah Johnson was killed instantly. The standoff ended without officers entering the building, but it also ended any possibility of a trial, testimony, or legal resolution in court. There would be no charges filed, no jury seated, and no sentencing phase. The case closed at the scene, leaving behind unanswered questions that still echo years later. Was this an act of terrorism, a personal vendetta, or a collision of unresolved trauma and rage? Did the unprecedented use of a bomb-carrying robot save lives, or did it quietly redefine the limits of state power in moments of crisis? The Dallas ambush forced the nation to confront uncomfortable realities. It exposed how quickly political anger can turn lethal, how military training can be repurposed against domestic targets, and how law enforcement itself is adapting to threats once thought unimaginable on American streets. The officers who died that night never had the chance to defend themselves, and the method used to stop the shooter raised a question that still divides public opinion when there is no other option left. How far is too far to stop the killing? Gavin Eugene Long, State, Louisiana, age 29, killed in the act. Just 10 days after the massacre in Dallas, as the nation was still reeling and law enforcement agencies were on edge, another ambush unfolded, this time in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Gavin Eugene Long, a 29-year-old former U.S. Marine, would turn a routine police response into a scene of sudden and calculated violence. The timing alone sent shockwaves through the country. 2 attacks, 2 cities, less than 2 weeks apart. To many it felt less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a dangerous pattern. Long was not unknown to authorities, but neither was he on any active watch list. Originally from Kansas City, he had served in the U.S. Marine Corps and completed a deployment to Iraq. After leaving the military, his life drifted into isolation. Online, he built a digital footprint filled with anti-government rhetoric, conspiracy theories, and repeated denunciations of police violence. His anger appeared to intensify after the fatal police shooting of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge earlier that month. To Long, that case was not an isolated incident, but proof of a system he believed was irreparably corrupt. In the early morning hours of July 17, 2016, Baton Rouge police officers responded to a report of a man with a gun near a shopping center. It was a call they had answered countless times before. What they walked into instead was a carefully staged ambush. Long, armed with a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun, opened fire almost immediately. Investigators later determined that he discharged at least 43 rounds. 3 officers were killed. 3 others were wounded. The attack unfolded rapidly, leaving little time for reaction or defense. Witnesses described the sound of gunfire echoing across the parking lot as officers scrambled for cover. The shooter moved deliberately, exploiting confusion and proximity. Unlike spontaneous acts of violence, this was controlled, targeted, and relentless. Law enforcement agencies across the region were immediately alerted, and a massive tactical response followed. Within minutes, SWAT teams converged on the area, tracking Long as he attempted to evade capture. The confrontation ended with Long being shot and killed by police at the scene. No arrest, no interrogation, no trial. Alongside his body, investigators later found evidence that suggested he expected to die that day, including writings interpreted as a suicide note. Whatever explanations or justifications he may have believed in died with him, leaving only fragments pieced together by investigators and analysts. The Baton Rouge ambush intensified national fears that police officers were becoming symbolic targets rather than responders to crime. Coming so soon after Dallas, it raised urgent questions about whether these attacks were isolated eruptions of rage or signs of something spreading. The combination of military training, ideological radicalization, and grievance-driven violence proved lethal in a matter of seconds. With no courtroom proceedings and no sentencing, the aftermath was defined by funerals, public mourning, and unanswered questions. Was Gavin Long driven by personal trauma, political extremism, or a desire for martyrdom? And more unsettling still, how many warning signs can exist in plain sight before violence moves from online rhetoric to real-world bloodshed? Hollis Daniels Iii, State, Texas, age 19, sentenced to life. What happened on the Texas Tech campus in October 2017 shattered one of the most basic assumptions in modern policing, that once a suspect is inside a police station, the danger has passed. Hollis Daniels Iii was only 19 years old, a freshman student whose life, on the surface, looked unremarkable. He had been arrested for possessing a firearm and drugs inside a university dormitory, a serious offense but one that typically ends with paperwork, charges, and a court date. Instead, it ended with a police officer dead inside his own station. Daniels was taken to the Texas Tech University Police Department headquarters in Lubbock, Texas, on October 9, 2017. Bodycam footage later confirmed what would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Daniels had already been searched. Officers believed he was unarmed. He was placed in an interview room, sitting alone with Officer Floyd East Jr., a veteran campus police officer and a father of 2. The setting was quiet, controlled, and routine. There was no indication that the teenager sitting across the table was moments away from committing murder. In a matter of seconds, everything unraveled. As Officer East stood nearby, Daniels reached toward the officer's duty belt. Whether through sudden movement or a lapse in awareness, Daniels managed to seize East's service weapon. Before the officer could react, Daniels fired a single shot into his head. Officer East collapsed to the floor, mortally wounded. Daniels stepped over him, exited the building, and fled into the campus area, leaving behind a scene that stunned responding officers and administrators alike. A campus-wide lockdown followed as law enforcement launched a massive search. Students sheltered in place while police units scoured the area, treating a college campus like an active crime zone. Roughly 2 hours later, Daniels was located and taken into custody without further bloodshed. By then, Officer East had died from his injuries. The reality was unavoidable. A police officer had been killed not during a chase or shootout, but inside a station after an arrest, under circumstances that exposed devastating vulnerabilities. The legal process moved slowly but deliberately. Prosecutors charged Daniels with capital murder, a charge that typically opens the door to the death penalty. However, due to his age at the time of the crime and other legal considerations, execution was ultimately taken off the table. In 2023, following proceedings conducted under a strict media gag order, Daniels pleaded guilty. There would be no dramatic trial, no disputed facts. The evidence, including video footage and Daniels' own confession, left little room for doubt. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. A permanent end to freedom, imposed on someone who was still a teenager when he committed the crime. For the family of Officer Floyd East Jr., no sentence could restore what was lost. For law enforcement nationwide, the case triggered painful questions about officer safety, search procedures, and the illusion of security once a suspect is in custody. Gary Rowland, State, Kentucky, age 30, killed in the act. In 2022, inside the Marshall County Sheriff's Office in Kentucky, a belief that handcuffs equal control was shattered in seconds. Gary Rowland had already been arrested for parole violations tied to drugs and weapons. He had been searched. He had been restrained. To deputies, the threat appeared neutralized. What followed exposed a dangerous illusion of safety, one that would cost a veteran officer his life. Rowland was being held inside the sheriff's office, not on a roadside, not in a dark alley, but within the walls of a law enforcement building. This was supposed to be the most secure point in the entire arrest process. Yet somewhere between protocol and assumption, a fatal gap opened. Despite being handcuffed, Rowland had managed to keep a firearm concealed on his body. Investigators later focused on how that weapon was missed, and whether the search that should have prevented it was rushed, incomplete, or improperly executed. At some point during his detention, Rowland made his move. Outside an office area, he drew the hidden gun and opened fire. Chief Deputy Jody Cash was struck and fatally wounded before officers could react. The attack was sudden and decisive, leaving no opportunity for de-escalation or defense. In a matter of moments, a law enforcement leader was down inside his own workplace, killed by someone who was already supposed to be fully under control. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Deputies engaged Rowland, and he was shot and killed at the scene. The threat ended as quickly as it began, but the damage was irreversible. There would be no arrest photo, no court filings, no trial. With the suspect dead, the criminal case ended instantly, replaced by internal investigations, external scrutiny, and the weight of public outrage. As details emerged, the focus shifted from Rowland himself to the system that failed to stop him. How does a handcuffed detainee keep a gun? How does a search miss a weapon capable of killing a chief deputy? Those questions fueled lawsuits and policy reviews, turning the case into more than just another line of duty death. It became a symbol of procedural vulnerability, a reminder that protocol only works when it is followed without shortcuts. For the family of Chief Deputy Jody Cash, the loss was absolute. A career dedicated to public service ended not during a chase or a shootout, but in a space assumed to be safe. For law enforcement agencies across the country, the case sent a chilling message. Security failures do not announce themselves loudly. They hide in routine, in repetition, in the quiet confidence that this has been done already. There was no sentence handed down, no judge's ruling, no jury verdict. But the consequences reached far beyond one building in Kentucky. This case forced an uncomfortable realization. If a restrained suspect inside a sheriff's office can still kill, then the most dangerous moment may not be the arrest itself, but the second everyone believes the danger is over. Eric Frein, State, Pennsylvania, age 31, death row. The night of September 12, 2014, was quiet in Blooming Grove, Pennsylvania, the kind of stillness that usually signals routine patrols and uneventful shifts. But hidden in the surrounding woods, Eric Frein was waiting. At 31 years old, Frein was not acting on impulse. He was executing a plan rooted in ideology, preparation, and a desire to ignite what he believed would be a larger uprising against the government. By the time the gunfire ended, one state trooper was dead, another critically wounded, and Pennsylvania was about to launch one of the largest manhunts in its history. Frein was a survivalist, deeply immersed in extremist beliefs and anti-government thinking. He lived a life shaped by isolation and preparation, stockpiling supplies, studying police routines, and training himself to disappear into the wilderness. He had participated in historical war reenactments, gaining familiarity with weapons and tactical movement. Investigators later concluded that Frein specifically targeted the Pennsylvania State Police, believing that attacking law enforcement would serve as a spark for broader rebellion. This was not random violence. It was symbolic, calculated, and intentional. That night, Frein ambushed the Blooming Grove State Police barracks from the tree line. Without warning, he opened fire, killing Corporal Brian Dixon and seriously wounding Trooper Alex Douglas. The attack was swift and precise. Frein vanished back into the woods, leaving behind shell casings, confusion, and fear. Within hours, the scale of the response grew rapidly. Local police, state troopers, federal agents, and tactical teams flooded the region. Roads were shut down. Schools were closed. Residents were told to stay inside. What followed was a 48-day manhunt involving more than 1,000 law enforcement officers and costing millions of dollars. Helicopters circled overhead. Thermal imaging scanned the forest. Armed patrols moved through rugged terrain, knowing they were hunting someone who had trained specifically to avoid capture. Frein survived off the land, stealing food when necessary, using the environment as his shield. Each day that passed without an arrest deepened public anxiety and tested the limits of coordinated law enforcement operations. On October 30, 2014, the manhunt finally ended when Frein was captured near an abandoned airport hangar. He did not resist. After weeks of tension, the arrest was almost anticlimactic. But the case was far from over. In 2017, Frein stood trial, facing charges including murder, terrorism, and aggravated assault. Prosecutors presented evidence of planning, extremist intent, and deliberate targeting of police. The jury returned a verdict that reflected the severity of the crimes, a death sentence. More than a decade later, that sentence has not been carried out. Frein remains on death row, his execution delayed by appeals and the slow machinery of capital punishment. The contrast is stark. A trooper's life ended in seconds. A statewide community lived in fear for weeks. Yet the punishment itself stretches across years, even decades. Jeremy Powell, State, Mississippi, age 23, killed in the act. On April 4, 2013, inside the Jackson Police Department in Mississippi, a room designed for questioning became a permanent record of failure, violence, and death. Jeremy Powell, just 23 years old, had been brought in for questioning in connection with the homicide of Christopher Alexander. The setting was controlled, quiet, and fully recorded. Cameras were rolling, Officers believed they were managing a suspect, not sitting across from a man who had already decided how the encounter would end. Powell was placed in an interrogation room with Detective Eric Smith, a veteran investigator doing what he had done countless times before. There was no active chaos, no visible weapon, no immediate threat. But within moments, the dynamic shifted. In a sudden burst of movement, Powell lunged forward and grabbed Smith's service weapon. The struggle lasted seconds. There was no time for backup to intervene, no opportunity for de-escalation. Powell fired, striking Detective Smith fatally. What happened next unfolded with brutal clarity on video. Almost immediately after shooting the detective, Powell turned the gun on himself and pulled the trigger. Another officer rushed into the room and fired a single shot at Powell, but it was already over. Powell died at the scene. Detective Eric Smith also died from his injuries. The entire sequence, from calm questioning to fatal gunfire, was captured on camera, leaving no room for speculation about how fast control can collapse inside a police interview room. Because Powell was dead, there would be no charges filed, no courtroom testimony, and no verdict. The legal process ended where the violence ended. Investigators were left to reconstruct intent rather than prosecute it. One theory quickly emerged and has lingered ever since: suicide by cop. Powell was facing serious criminal exposure for an alleged homicide. For some offenders, the interrogation room becomes a final stage, not for defense, but for escape. Death, in that mindset, is preferable to a lifetime behind bars. The video evidence turned this case into more than a tragedy. It became a training tool, a warning, and a source of public outrage. How could a suspect gain access to an officer's weapon inside an interrogation room? What safeguards failed? And how many similar rooms across the country rely on assumptions rather than physical barriers to keep officers safe? These questions echoed far beyond Jackson, forcing departments nationwide to reassess procedures that had gone largely unquestioned. For the family of Detective Eric Smith, the loss was sudden and senseless. A routine interrogation ended his life, not because of a prolonged confrontation, but because of a single, irreversible lapse in control. For the public, the footage was haunting. Watching violence unfold in real time strips away distance and denial. It shows how quickly authority can be overturned, and how deadly that reversal can be. There was no sentence in this case, no punishment measured in years or decades. But the implications were severe. When a suspect decides that death is the outcome he wants, the interrogation room itself becomes a weapon. And the most unsettling question remains: if everything is being recorded, if everyone follows protocol, how does this still happen? Brian Nichols, State, Georgia, age 33, sentenced to life. On the morning of March 11, 2005, the Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta was operating under the assumption that justice was contained, controlled, and secure. Brian Nichols, a 33-year-old defendant already in custody for a violent rape charge, was brought into the building for what should have been another routine day of court proceedings. Within hours, that assumption would collapse, leaving 4 people dead and an entire city locked in fear. Nichols was not an outsider breaching the system. He was already inside it. During transport within the courthouse, he overpowered a female sheriff's deputy, disarmed her, and took her service weapon. What followed was rapid, targeted violence in one of the most symbolically protected spaces in the justice system. Nichols moved through the courthouse halls and opened fire, killing a judge, a court reporter, and the deputy who had been escorting him. In minutes, the courthouse transformed from a place of order into a crime scene soaked in blood and confusion. But the violence did not end there. Nichols escaped the courthouse and disappeared into Atlanta. triggering what would become the largest manhunt in the city's history. Law enforcement agencies flooded the streets. Helicopters circled overhead. Schools, businesses, and government buildings went into lockdown. As the city searched for him, Nichols struck again. He tracked down and murdered a federal agent who had previously worked on his rape case, extending the day's death toll and confirming that this was not random violence, but vengeance-driven and deliberate. For hours, Nichols evaded capture, blending into neighborhoods and moving through the city while armed and dangerous. He eventually invaded an apartment, taking a woman hostage. In a chilling twist, it was not force but conversation that ended the standoff. After hours of negotiation, Nichols surrendered peacefully, bringing a citywide nightmare to an end. 4 lives had been taken in less than a single day, all tied to one escape that should never have happened. The legal aftermath was massive. In 2008, Nichols stood trial facing 54 charges, including multiple counts of murder, escape, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that the scope, planning, and brutality of the crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. But when the jury deliberated, they failed to reach a unanimous decision on execution. That single fracture changed everything. Instead of death row, Nichols was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again, but he would continue to live. For many, that outcome was as shocking as the crimes themselves. How could someone who killed a judge, a deputy, a court employee, and a federal agent in one day avoid execution? These cases leave behind more than statistics and headlines. They expose a disturbing pattern where moments assumed to be controlled become fatal, where handcuffs, courtrooms, and police stations fail to guarantee safety. Each name in this series represents not only a violent offender, but a system tested at its weakest points, often with irreversible consequences. As these stories fade from the news cycle, the risks they revealed remain very real. The question now is not whether these attacks can happen again, but whether the lessons learned will be enough to prevent the next one. Do you believe justice was ultimately served in these cases, or did the system fail when it mattered most?